Good day and welcome back to another World of Warcraft video. In this video we're going to be talking about the changes to Mythic Plus and what it potentially means going forward for World of Warcraft, and the changes and how they affect the heroic dungeons, as well as also how they affect the Mythic dungeon experience. So let's first understand basically what Mythic Plus was previously. So before, in World of Warcraft, obviously your queuable experience, as still is, ends with heroic dragonflight dungeons, and then what would happen is afterwards you would have to enter into the Mythic era. So you'd have to go to pre-made groups, go to dungeons, find a group, and then look for Mythic dungeons, right? And the thing is, you could either find a group or start a group. And when you were doing dungeons and trying to do things like Mythic, what would happen is Mythic was basically considered entry-level content. So heroic dungeons were essentially considered, how can I say it, like skippable content outside of the beginning of a patch. And then essentially what would happen was Mythic Plus would take over and you would just start cycling through Mythic Plus, working super hard to get keys and things of such nature. So the thing is Mythic Keystones and Mythic Plus used to scale quite high. People used to go to things like plus 25, plus 30, but what this was doing was creating a very stressful environment for players through which to progress. Basically, there was no window for which players were not being timed to earn rewards, to not gain rewards. So, for example, if we take a look, you would be able to play up to Heroic, grab yourself some somewhat decent loot. I mean, this is literally worse than doing world quests. Still is. Then you would move on to Mythic, which was like, oh, okay, now I'm getting Raid Finder level loot. Then you would move on to Mythic Plus, which was like, okay, now, depending on the scaling, I'll be getting essentially all the way up to Heroic level raiding loot. Now, the thing is, with Mythic Plus as a concept, it's great because it endorses smaller PvE content, makes things far more acceptable for the player base. But the problem is that the gap between baseline Mythic Plus and top level Mythic Plus was too big. So what was happening was you were getting pockets of dead space where players who aren't really good or weren't too great were essentially stuck doing, like, let's say Mythic Plus 5 to 10, but there was no one in that range to actually do it with them because the scaling was too big, the differences was too big, everyone was just struggling far too much to do the content. So essentially what the game has done is it has cut down the window in which you can now essentially do content in. So if we take a look at the progression here, which you can see, yeah, here we go. You can see that they've really cut down the window in which players can progress in. So before, previously, Heroic was kind of like a dead space. And then you would have Mythic Plus, and you can see the gap between the two was very small, like this. Okay. Then you had this huge window and gap where players were kind of falling in between, and what was happening was there were dead spaces. So like between Mythic 5 and like Mythic 11, there was a very small player base comparative to between Mythic 1 and Mythic 5, and like all the way up here, where you would end up with your elite characters or players. And what was happening was you were ending up with a big dead space gap. This was causing player base issues, people trying to find people to do content with, to do content altogether. Now what they've done is they've created a situation whereby Mythic 0, or doing a standard Mythic dungeon, is now a much closer experience to being a hard content experience. So instead of Mythic being now considered, as it was, like, entry level content, Mythic 0 is now like the same difficulty as Mythic 10. It is a very acceptably difficult piece of content. Now obviously because of that, what it's done is it's bridged the gap here, whereby there's now a smaller pocket of gap for players to fall into, which means your population pools should be in theory larger. So people doing Mythic 1, 2, 3, and 4 should in theory be larger now than it was before. And you can kind of see that, like if I go to the dungeon finder, if I go to pre-made groups and I look to find a group, you can see already that there's a pretty good spread available in terms of groups. We have a +0, we have a +5, we have a +2, 6, 7, 8, 2, 13, 10, 9, 8, 10. You can still see it's up higher. Like you can still see there are some higher ones, but you can see there's a nice mixture of lower ones as well. So obviously it has to some extent helped, but the real question is how much will it help overall? Now the distinct difference between before and now in terms of the content itself is that heroic is now obviously a bit more challenging than it was previous, with the stats and everything being brought into a line with Mythic level difficulty. So the tuning and rewards have been increased to baseline Mythic. So basically, as you can see, if you look back at the graph, Heroic is now the same level of difficulty as Mythic, however you don't have the same mechanics that are present in the Mythic dungeon. So you still need to obviously prep yourself for a change in mechanics between Heroic and Mythic. However, the actual tuning and difficulty of the stat requirements, the windows, the timings, the DPS requirements have matched now to that previous window. So Heroic should be more challenging. Entering a Heroic should be a more challenging LFR or looking for group experience, but it should in theory be also a lot more rewarding for the player base, or closer in experience to Mythic, so that you can obviously now have a little bit more of a challenge. It's a bit more of a fun, enjoyable kind of experience. I think where I find an issue with this is the gap between rewards is still very large. And I know it's because it is a LFG experience, but the fact that you are getting adventurer level gear when you could just enter into any raid that is awakened and get the same level as Mythic plus gear is a little bit, yeah, I still don't think that's really the same. Like, I don't think that's the space you want to be in, because like getting the same level of gear from an LFR is not a, yeah, it's not a like instinctively difficult game mode. Like, okay, it's worse gear, but like it's not an instinctively difficult game mode. So being able to bridge that gap between is kind of a little bit debatable for me. I think they need to consider that. Like having such a large gap, if you look at their graph, having such a large gap now between Heroic and Mythic Plus could cause more issues for me in terms of getting people to bridge that gap. A player jumping from Heroic to Mythic now has actually technically more of an issue than they did before. So there is that slight concern, but we're just going to have to see. For now, I think what they've done is they've condensed their pool of really, really good experienced players, made it so that it is much more populated within those segmented sections, and so getting Mythic Plus content done should be more accessible to those players who want to be there, and it's made it a more hardcore community, kept it a little bit more separate from the casual community, but in a way strengthened that community as well. But I think the gap between Heroic and Mythic could deter potentially growing that community, and you could end up with a very isolated community in future. But that's my opinion. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. And yeah, for now, that's it from me. Bye.